Good evening. I'm David Wheeler, Executive Director of Conserve Wildlife Foundation. Thank you to Cape May County Library for hosting this event. I'm going to pull up the presentation now. And I'm here, of course, today to speak to you about migration, mainly in birds, but we're going to look at some other animals as well, and particularly as it relates to the landscape here in New Jersey. And we are in a great place, about as good a place as anywhere. Especially, I imagine most of you who live in Cape May County or thereabouts are in a particularly globally important place to enjoy the spectacle of migration. First, a brief note about myself and my organization. As I mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Conserve Wildlife Foundation. I've been here for the past 8 years. I previously taught environmental communications at Rutgers School of Environmental and Biological Sciences for around 8 years. And I also am the author of the 2011 book, Wild New Jersey, Nature Adventures in the Garden State. And we're going to hear a couple of very brief excerpts from that later that are particularly pertinent to migration. My organization, Conserve Wildlife Foundation, for the past 20 years has worked to protect rare wildlife here in New Jersey and beyond, but most of our work does take place here in New Jersey. We do that through our biologists doing things like banding and tracking wildlife species, restoring habitat, uh, doing basically field work is really what our organization is based on. And what supports that is our education and public engagement. We teach educational programs based in STEM or STEAM all around the state. And of course, public engagement through programs like this one. Our organization has played a key role in the very inspiring recoveries of species like the bald eagle, peregrine falcon, osprey, and bobcat. And at the same time, on the flip side, we've also been a part of really fighting off the declines, significant declines of groups of species such as bats and pollinators and songbirds, and trying to make sure that they continue to have a place here in New Jersey. So, some good news, some bad news in the world of rare wildlife here in New Jersey, but certainly our biologists are doing everything they can to give us more of that good news. And so I think about as good a way as any to start the tale of migration here in New Jersey is with a project that our biologists have worked on since our inception in partnership with the state of New Jersey and as well as federal agencies and other nonprofits. And that's the migratory shorebirds, red knots, that takes place right in Cape May County, as well as across the Delaware Bay shore. This spectacle migration is globally significant, and it's frankly, it's anytime I think about it, I'm inspired and a little awed by exactly what happens every year with these shorebirds. And so the red knot is a robin-sized bird. It's kind of medium. It's a pretty bird, but it's not something that stands out as particularly exotic looking or anything like that. But the red knot has unfortunately become endangered in the last few decades. It's declined sharply. And the red knot, ruddy turnstone, and some other shorebirds, migratory shorebirds, depend on horseshoe crab eggs. And as their horseshoe crabs have declined sharply, the shorebirds have followed suit, although there's a number of reasons for their decline. And migration is absolutely key to this story. So these horseshoe crab eggs are packed with energy, and horseshoe crabs, one of the most primitive creatures on Earth, predated the dinosaurs. They've survived 5 mass extinctions, and now they grace us with their presence along our coastline. But they gather in particularly large numbers on the west side of Cape May County, along the Delaware Bay shore, in places like Reed's Beach. And there they spawn every May and lay thousands and thousands of eggs, like you see here on the left photo. Reminds me a little bit of caviar. It's kind of the caviar of the Delaware Bay. And they lay these eggs, and some of them survive to become horseshoe crabs. but many more are instead fuel the food chain of Delaware Bay, which is one of the most vibrant ecosystems on the whole East Coast. As you may know, it's more remote than the rest of New Jersey. The coastline has a lot of intact salt marsh, a lot of really healthy estuaries, and not nearly as densely populated as the rest of the state. As a result, it's a real haven for wildlife, everything from bald eagles to river otters to shorebirds and horseshoe crabs. And these energy-packed horseshoe crab eggs are exactly why the migration of these migratory shorebirds takes place. And what a migration it is. These shorebirds fly from as far south as Tierra del Fuego, the very southern tip of South America. So in other words, the first land you would come to if you're on a globe, spinning the globe around, and you come north from Antarctica, first land you hit is Tierra del Fuego. That's where these red knots and other shorebirds start their migration each spring. From there, they fly up from Tierra del Fuego, from other parts of Argentina and Brazil, all the way up to, among other places, but first and foremost, New Jersey's Delaware Bay shore. They descend on New Jersey's Delaware Bay and spend, each bird might spend around anywhere from a week to 3 weeks. Overall, the whole season, for our purposes, observing it or studying it, the whole season basically lasts the month of May, give or take a few days on either end. And they do this simply because they need that fuel of the horseshoe crab eggs. And that seems like quite a migration in itself. If it stopped there, it would still be a pretty world-class story. But that's only part of it. The second part of it is that once they have gathered enough energy and fat reserves to make the second leg of their journey, they then fly all the way up to the Canadian Arctic. We're talking really remote tundra, uninhabited. Our scientists have had polar bear encounters in the past there. So it really is about as remote as it gets, and about as far flung from New Jersey on either end, the north end in the Arctic or the south end in Tierra del Fuego, as you can imagine. And this is all following these medium-sized birds in their migration every year, flying over 9,000 miles. Absolutely incredible. And this, again, is fueled by these tiny little horseshoe crab eggs. And New Jersey and the Delaware Bay is the centerpiece. KMA is the centerpiece of this hemisphere-wide migration. And of course, after the summer up in the Arctic, they then fly all the way back down to Tierra del Fuego. At that point, they've hopefully bred, they've hopefully enhanced their population, and giving these birds another stronger shot going into the next year. Unfortunately, and as we'll hear about later too with many of the other birds, they are at risk of so many. All wildlife in New Jersey or anywhere is at risk of countless threats. But when you're talking about birds that migrate across these vast areas, you're basically exacerbating each threat by quite a bit, because now there's individual locations beyond. It's not just that one location, but different ones in different countries, different continents, all of them that potentially offer a whole new suite of risks, in addition to the travel risks, which we'll come to later. So this really is a world-class migration, but in many ways, it's also mirrored by, if not quite as extensive as this one, other migrations across the bird world in particular that have this kind of massive scope. And I'm sorry, and one last point I wanted to make, just to put these in perspective. The red knot, there's an individual red knot. As I mentioned, we band red knots every May in Delaware Bay. And one red knot was banded many years ago and recited over the course of all the scientific studies. Over many years, we recited, and we're able to, each band has an individual number. And so we were able to say, okay, here's the same individual that was born 5 years ago. And a few years later, this was the same individual born 10 years ago. It turned out this bird lived at least 18 years. And in us getting that data and those resightings over the years, we realized that this bird had flown the equivalent of the journey from the Earth to the moon and halfway back. It was then given the nickname Moonbird, and even after that, it was still spotted a couple more years. And so this individual bird, just to think about it, a bird the size, you look out your window right now, or maybe in a little lighter time of day, and see a robin, on a perched on a branch right outside your window, a bird that size flying the distance to the moon and back over the course of its life. Absolutely incredible, and so inspiring to see that a bird can do something like that, particularly with all the challenges it faces. And so we'll step back now and look kind of at the bigger picture. Well, what is migration? I mean, we all kind of know what it is, but let's take a little closer look at what really that entails. And a little more than half of the species of birds in North America migrate. And those migrations vary widely. I mean, in some cases, you have these extensive migrations like the red knot. In other cases, it might be the equivalent of a few states. Some birds, some species rather, have some birds that migrate and others that just stay put. So it does change a bit, both across groups of birds and then across individual species as well. But it's pretty incredible too, because then even beyond that, even beyond North America, you have some birds that actually do migrations up a mountainside. When you picture massive world-class mountains like the Himalayas or the Andes, actually migrations to higher levels of that mountain, because the climate is so different, the conditions are so different, and the prey is so different. So you have different really kinds of migrations that range quite a bit. But one of the common threads is that it's all about going from a low amount of resources, and by that, the food that fuels them, the safety, the shelter, how their extent of risk towards other predators. So it's those kind of moving from low resources to high resources, and so moving north in the spring is for many of the species really vital. And think about going. These birds would never spend much time in the Canadian Arctic at other times of the year, but in summer, it's filled with insects, mosquitoes, and other insects emerging in massive numbers. So it's a huge prey base for the birds. It's these enormously flat areas of tundra for birds like the shorebirds that can then nest and feel safe from predators. They're not nearly as much at risk as they would be in other kinds of habitat. So you have these really high resources in the summer. Makes it ideal for nesting, and then come the other times of the year, they fly to where they'll get similar kinds of levels of resources in vastly different habitats and locations. Similarly, the boreal forest in a little lower, not as north as the Arctic, but stretching across Canada and the farthest northern reaches of the U.S. The boreal forest also, you have these vast uninhabited places that are great for a number of our songbirds that might spend other parts of the year in much more warmer and tropical climates, but during summer, it's an ideal place for them to nest. And so these migrations have evolved over thousands of years. They're genetically basically a part of these individual birds, and in many ways it's hard to fathom. Especially with us, we have to teach kids different things. There's certain things they have innately, and other things we have to teach them. But when you think about migration, just for me, it's always been fascinating to think about that first year of a bird migrating. How much of that is genetic and instinctual, that allows that individual bird in its first year to basically undertake this massive journey to a destination unknown at that time, and yet carry it out with such success that they're able to continue this each year. And of course, after that first year, then they have all those other attributes in their factor, because then they have the familiarity, they have the visible reminders. But that first year, it's mind-boggling to me, and I don't think I'll ever cease to be fascinated by that. Um, but well, what some of the things that trigger this migration in the first place? I mean, we can look at it and say, okay, around this time every year is when they leave, then they arrive around this time, and we can see the patterns. But for the birds themselves, some of the things that trigger it, probably the first and foremost thing is the length of day. Of course, as we get near summer each year, the days get a little longer, a little more sunlight, just by a minute or a minute and a half each day. You get a little more sunlight, but those lengths of day are really major triggers for birds to migrate. And of course, each species has their own specific triggers as to what that entails. But the length of day really is kind of what activates that readiness to migrate for the individual birds. And what's extraordinary is that you see this even in caged birds who have never done a migration. Um, they actually start to show behaviors, start to orient their body, and start to show a restlessness at the exact same time, as studies have shown, at the exact same time as their wilder relatives. Um, and basically it just shows just how much this is an internal part of their biological clock and their internal biology. Um, so day length is really probably the primary trigger, but there's a lot of others that go into it too. You're looking at the temperatures. As the temperatures start to reach certain levels, that triggers it. The food sources for individual birds may trigger it, and of course genetics are a big part of it too. So ultimately, that combination makes the birds ready to start the migration. But then once they start migrating, well, what guides them? And particularly, I'm thinking the younger birds, that it's not just a familiarity thing that they've done now for 5 years or 10 years, but what helps guide them in the first place. And much of it has to do with the magnetic field of the Earth. Birds are much more attuned to that than we as humans are. In many ways, they're able to almost see the magnetic field. That certainly sense it, but in some studies indicate they may actually be able to see the changes in magnetic field as you get to different latitudes around the world. So as you get further south or further north, there's slight changes in the magnetic field. The birds sense that. Some birds also use the sun, use the stars, use physical landmarks, and some birds are believed to even use smell, even though that's not considered to be a major factor for most birds. Some birds, they believe that also may be, and I give them an idea of where exactly they're going and when exactly they're stopping those migrations to basically find their arrival destination. As I mentioned, these migrations are pretty challenging, and certainly for us to fathom. They seem overwhelming to do this each year as part of their life cycle. Because if you think about it, you have the stress of the flight itself, which is, you're talking days, at least days on end of flight with minimal stopping. They have to find food along the way. You have major weather systems that they could be flying through. It could be approaching storms. It could be, particularly heavy rain. It could be strong winds. Any number of issues that could impede their migrations. And of course, then you have predators along the way, which again is another threat, particularly when they have to stop, if they're stopping for the night in these new places. You have all of those threats, and of course, then you have threats like buildings and towers and bridges, windmills, the lights of cities. All of these can be can cause impacts. Can basically, in many ways, can cause deaths for migrating birds. Fortunately, not to the degree that they yet that we know of, that really impacts individual species to such a great number that basically it's cutting into their viability moving forward. On the other hand, you add up all these, and if any one of these threats starts to really build, then you could actually really start to impact the population of an individual species. And so migration as a whole is is driven by so many factors. It's so complex, and yet it's a key part of the life cycle that they depend on for more than half of the birds in North America. So now we've met the red knot, but let's take a look at a few other species that kind of give an example of the wide range of migrants we have here in New Jersey and across the U.S. The Blackpool Warbler is a fascinating one. I mentioned about the boreal forest across Canada. You see on the map here, it goes really right across the heart of central and southern Canada before you get up into the treeless alpine tundra areas. And the blackpoll is a migrant songbird that flies up to that each year from the tropical regions of South America, particularly along the Amazon basin. So they start the year, and their winter is in that tropical area of South America. And this is a bird about the weight of a can of soda. So it's far smaller than the red knot. So it's a very small bird. Not atypical though for many of our neotropical migrants. And it flies up each spring through the eastern U.S. and through the Midwest to reach the boreal. And after spending the summer and nesting up there, it then flies down, in many ways flies out over open ocean, which is not fully common. It's not universal among birds. Some birds do it and some birds don't. And to return each year to the tropics. And the blackpoll is like many neotropical migrants, many of the songbirds we see each May, and particularly in Cape May, where it is about as good as anywhere in the world to see songbirds. Many of the birds that you'll be seeing in this coming April, May, and June follow similar cycles, and it may be slight changes in location, but that same general cycle of flying from the tropical regions of South America up to New Jersey or north of us to spend their summer and nest safely and feast on kind of this wide open prey base before heading south. Another interesting example that is New Jersey has a part of the nesting area here in New Jersey is the golden-winged warbler. The golden-winged warbler has a similar migration in many ways, although for the golden wing, when it comes up here to nest, when it comes up to North America to nest each summer, it's looking for a very specific kind of habitat beyond not just the boreal, but the golden wing is actually, warbler is actually looking for a young forest that hasn't aged into kind of it's more of a transition period that it needs. So it's a very specific kind of forest. And as you can imagine, at different times, for instance, I think back to the early 1900s when much of the farming that we had done here in New Jersey, the Garden State, in the 1700s and 1800s, much of that farmland had then been allowed to go fallow. People moved more to cities. Farms continued in many places, but also scaled back in many others. And so as we shifted much of our livelihoods from farming into other parts of the economy, you had many of these farms then, the fields then grew into forests. During that period of time, it was probably heaven for golden-winged warblers in many parts of New Jersey and the Northeast, because you had so many of these farmlands that were kind of in that intermediate stage of young forest. In recent years, not so much, because in recent years, most of the forest we have has been intact now for many decades. It's not old growth by any means, but it's also not particularly young. It's established, and outside of the deer overbrowsing the understory, you don't have, you certainly aren't having that young forest appeal that golden-winged warblers and many other species need. There are certain areas in Sussex County, northwest New Jersey, where you have more of the young forest, and you have other restoration that our biologists are partnering with other groups to do to restore young forests and to kind of create this habitat for golden-winged warblers, for bog turtles, for some other species that depend on that successional stage. And so their migration becomes even trickier than kind of that typical neotropical songbird, because they have to not only do the same migration, but have to do it and arrive in that very precise habitat that they depend on. And as a result, we've seen their numbers drop by over 2/3 over the last 50 years. And in New Jersey, they're down to really just a handful, maybe a couple dozen individuals potentially here in New Jersey. Their numbers are slightly better in some of the other uh, inland parts of the state, particularly along the Appalachian Ridge. But overall, their numbers are very much declined. They're one of the most at-risk songbirds, neotropical songbird migrants we have. So another example of just how intricate and how dependent on these very specific needs that the bird's migration can be. Excuse me. The another migration with a very different kind of bird is the osprey, and the osprey is a great example of raptors migrating. So we've looked at songbirds, we've looked at shorebirds, raptors migrating, and we'll look at with ospreys, which certainly in Cape May County you have no shortage of ospreys. Ospreys have made an incredible comeback here in New Jersey from just a few dozen in the late 70s to over 800 and growing now in New Jersey. Our biologists lead the way in erecting osprey platforms and up and down the New Jersey coast. At the same time, the water in New Jersey, the coastal water quality has improved so much. The Clean Water Act of the early 70s has helped our coastal waters increase dramatically in terms of their water quality. If you think about the early 80s, when you had the garbage barges off New York, you had tremendous wash-ups of garbage along our beaches. Of course, you had different oil spills along the more industrial urban corridors of waterways. And since then, we've seen much more improved water quality. The Delaware River, for example, has gone from being in the 60s and 70s so polluted that there was literally miles and miles of dead zones where nothing could grow. You had planes flying over where the pilot would get woozy and kind of lightheaded from the noxious fumes emitting from the Delaware River. Think about that then versus now, when it's this vibrant, this vibrant river with, while it still has, of course, challenges, the quality is phenomenal now compared to then. The osprey is one of the beneficiaries, along with many other wildlife species. So nonetheless, the osprey, of course, is a summer. It's really a summer symbol here of the Jersey Shore and the coast along the East Coast. And it spends its summer here each year, and then in early to mid fall, it flies south. And for the osprey, it typically will fly south to somewhere in northern South America and Central America. And so our biologists have gone and studied them down in Belize. The ones in New Jersey tend to go primarily to Venezuela and Colombia and spend the winters there before heading back north and then arriving back in the spring to become again a kind of a regular sighting and always a reassuring coastal sighting to see them flying with, as you see in the left photo here, flying with a fish in its talons as it returns from a flight over one of our bays or the ocean. Another raptor to point out is the Peregrine Falcon, which, like the osprey, has made an incredible recovery. The peregrine was wiped out entirely east of the Mississippi River by the 60s. And so not a single falcon east of the Mississippi, peregrine falcon east of the Mississippi at that point. They were since reintroduced in the early 80s, just a handful, and they have actually come back well. And I should say one of without getting sidetracked too much, the biggest factor in both the falcon and the osprey's decline, along with the bald eagle and many other species, was the chemical DDT that was so widely used for agriculture before it was outlawed. It went right up the food chain. and weaken the eggshells so that ospreys and peregrine falcons and eagles couldn't nest. And so nonetheless, after this sharp decline, they were reintroduced by scientists in the early 80s. And from there, DDT had finally gotten out of the birds' systems. And so you had this new generation of birds able to start fresh in New Jersey and neighboring states. And remarkably, now they nest in places like um, some of our major bridges, the George Washington Bridge, downtown Philadelphia and Manhattan. They rest on some of our highest points in the Jersey City Financial District, and and as well as in towers along the coast. And so you've seen them. You may have seen peregrine falcons anywhere along our coast. They are the fastest animal on Earth, and they hunt by diving from high in the sky at speeds over 200 miles an hour um, to hit their prey in midair, and basically kill them on impact. And that's how they feed. So unlike ospreys, which feed on fish, falcons feed on other birds. And falcons are an interesting combination because they don't all migrate. Many migrate down to the subtropical regions, such as the Caribbean or Florida. Um, but many other falcons stay local year round. And that's an adaptation just similarly as they've adapted to um, using our buildings and bridges and towers as nesting areas. They had once only had to rely on cliffs before the US was settled as much as it was. They've adapted in that way to modern human society. And they've also, their migrations have slightly changed for some of the birds. Again, some still migrate and some don't. We'll look at another example of this later. The piping plover, of course, that beloved and kind of signature beach nesting bird that we see up and down the East Coast. There you see the adorable little young baby piping plover on the left. These birds nest on our beaches. They have their population was very much in jeopardy over a decade ago. They've stabilized a bit, but they're very much one of our vulnerable species because, of course, nesting on beaches, they're at risk just as people are to climate change and to rising sea level, and greater coastal storms pose the risk long term of really, potentially wiping out the population. But piping plovers and other beach nesting birds spend their summers here nesting, and then in the case of plovers, they often will migrate down to Florida or the Bahamas for other times a year. And so there's a bit of a shorter migration than some of those other ones, but for them that's perfect. They have all these great beach areas during the winter that they can spend down there, and then they fly up to New Jersey and some of the neighboring states during the summers because they find those conditions to be ideal for them during that time of year. Now, to contrast some of those that we have here regularly in New Jersey, here's a couple birds that we've had sightings. They're by no means a regular bird. We've had a couple of albatross sightings, including one in Cape May County many years ago. We've had a magnificent frigate bird. You see the bird on the bottom. The frigate bird is more likely to be found in the Caribbean. If you've ever vacationed there, you might have seen one, as well as in many other places around the world. The albatross is found over open ocean. And these birds I wanted to just talk about in terms of migration. While it's not necessarily a true classic migration, it serves the same concept of being on the move at vast distances. And just to put into perspective, some of the vast amounts of flying these birds do is it's mind-blowing. It's so otherworldly. And to factor it in, first of all these birds, in the case of the albatross, can spend 2 months at a time flying, not even touching land, basically just flying nonstop. Many of these birds, not only these ocean-going birds like these two, but many of the other migrants we've talked about, have the capacity to even sleep while they're migrating. And they do it in such a way that scientists are still studying it, but they believe that in many cases they are able to shut down half of their brain, kind of one hemisphere of their brain, and sleep while the other one is still alert and functioning. Talk about remarkable, and talk about just hard to fathom. Um, but this is, you know, an example of these kind of these adaptations these birds have done, have undertaken over eons to be able to undertake these massive migrations, or in the case of these long-lasting flights. You know, they can go, to put a couple other things, they can go, you know, hundreds of miles, they can go hours without even flapping their wings, simply by riding the winds and the thermals. Um, and in the case of the frigate bird is maybe the only bird that is known to actually fly up into the cumulus clouds. They can fly that high, and it's freezing up there. They've developed different adaptations that allow them to do that, and they can fly up at those heights. And if you think about how challenging that is, think about when you've ever taken a plane flight and gone through turbulence, and that's typically you're going through a cloud and there's whatever weather conditions in there. And here you have a bird that is doing that at this freezing temperatures, at these thousands and thousands of feet above our typical atmosphere and our day-to-day lives. And here you have a bird doing that. It's, you know, mind-boggling. And so, just to give you, for those map lovers in the audience, to give you just a general idea of, you know, where do these migrations take place. On the left, you just see a few examples of different species. Again, there's hundreds and hundreds of species. Again, 350 in North America that migrate. You can more than double that in other parts of the world. So, you know, you're talking well over thousands of species that migrate. But this is just a few examples on the left, just those individual species, to kind of show how each one has their own different focuses, different starting points and endpoints. On the right, you see more grouped, and for our purposes here in the eastern U.S., the dark blue oval shape, roughly, it's around the third or fourth from the left. That is that's where you can group most of the East Coast migrants, somewhere in that range. So typically, starting somewhere from either the ending somewhere from the tundra, boreal, or in New Jersey for those nesting here, and depending on the time of year, either starting or finishing up in anywhere in the tropics, anywhere from really from the southern U.S. and Florida down through the Bahamas and Caribbean, and then through northern South America and the Amazon basin, all the way down to the southern tip. So you have these massive ranges that different individual species will migrate parts of it. And I should mention too, with the peregrine falcon, they're a good example of leapfrogging. And so, which sounds counterintuitive. And what I mean by that is, you have some peregrine falcons that migrate, as an example, let's say from New Jersey to Florida. Okay, so you're migrating kind of this middle section of the large hemisphere-wide scope you see there. And then you have other peregrine falcons that might start in, say, New England, that will migrate further south than the ones in New Jersey did. So they're leapfrogging. And that's unique to certain species. Not all species do that at all. But the ones that do that, scientists believe that the reason they do that is because over time, the later start for the northern birds, by the time they're arriving to the same destinations as the southern birds, they're already taken. The land is already taken, kind of the ideal habitat is already taken, so they continue flying south. And then over time, it became established that way. Certainly counterintuitive and not what you would guess. But for some birds, that's how it's worked out, and it's clearly working for them. And to put it into perspective, we've been talking all about birds, but there's many other species that do it as well. Here's a few in New Jersey that that also migrate. You have bats. We have 9 species of bats in New Jersey, 3 of which are migrants. The other 6 of which hibernate. They spend their winters hibernating in caves or mines. But 3 bat species: the silver bat, the hoary, and what's the other one? Oh, the eastern red bat. Those 3 migrate south, and we're talking migrating primarily to maybe the southern U.S. These don't match up to some of the phenomenal bird migrations we've talked about. But let's be realistic. These are animals the size of a mouse with wings, and they're flying every year as part of their life cycle down, down to Georgia or Florida. So let's not poo-poo that, and just because it doesn't match the red knot doesn't mean it's not pretty extraordinary in its own right. And they do this each year. In some cases, they even still hibernate. But for those specific species, they need warmer temperatures in the winter than the 6 species that spend their lives year-round hibernating in New Jersey. The monarch may be the most phenomenal migration of all, in that they do their migration over generations. And of course, their decline has been really significant over recent decades. In many ways, they're an indicator for pollinators as a whole. Pollinators are vital to our lives. 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat is because of a pollinator. Pollinators make almost all of our fruits and vegetables possible, but they also make almost all of the flowering plants and flowers possible, which basically it's, other than our health, our ecosystem, our economy, and all the food chains that depend on pollinators, they're not that important. But no, they really are the base of pretty much everything in terms of wildlife, and they've declined sharply. Monarchs being a real centerpiece in that, and certainly our most probably charismatic and well-known pollinator, along with bumblebees. But monarchs' migration, they arrive here in New Jersey or further north in the Northeast or the Midwest every year, and then basically head back in early fall. Over the course of generations, head back to the mountains in central Mexico, where they can be found in mass numbers, and where unfortunately those numbers have declined so sharply. And so, like I said, they have to do these migrations in generations. So I've always been impressed by the fact that you have these interim generations where their whole life cycle is filling the role of the migration that their forebears and descendants kind of, each one takes its own niche within that migration. Just so phenomenal and so hard to understand, the instinct to do that, because it just kind of goes against not only what we as people have always seen, but even most of the wildlife that we've studied. You have it's individuals doing the migrations. It's not individuals taking a part of a larger migration. So certainly really fascinating. And in similar ways, the American eel has a pretty interesting story. I'm going to read you a quick excerpt about the American eel that talks about its migration. I joined Cheesequake State Park naturalist Jim Fazek on a seasonal April morning from a glassy walkway along the side of Hooks Creek Lake. Fazek abruptly careens down the other side of the bank, practically disappearing into the tall reeds along a tiny stream. He dips his net, sifting through wet leaves and mud for our trophy. Tiny killifish squirm through the first 2 catches, but the third time's a charm. We behold 3 inches of wriggling glass eel. Fully transparent, the eel resembles a slender ghost. 2 large eyes and a thin bloodline extend the length of its body. Those are the eel's only visible features. Glass eels, and you can see on the left in that bottom photo, the smaller ones on the left, over the word yellow eels. Those are kind of similar to what glass eels look like, except glass eels are completely transparent. Glass eels, the juvenile stage of the American eel, swim here all the way from the Sargasso Sea between Bermuda and the Bahamas. All along the East Coast, glass eels seek out narrow streams that funnel into cool, clean lakes with few predators. Thousands of glass eels use these spillways to reach the lakes and ponds each spring. Eventually, this glass eel is going to grow to an elver, into a green eel, an adult eel, up to 4 feet long, says Fazic. After sexually maturing, it will turn into a yellow eel, then a silver eel, and eventually a black eel when it's on its way back down to the Sargasso Sea. Once fully grown, these eels become aggressive and opportunistic predators, eating crabs and small fish during a lifespan that can reach 20 years. That seems like a long way away. The eel's life cycle recalls the human stages from newborn to senior citizen, growing up, moving out, traveling. Yes, the tiny glass eels of the Sargasso Sea swim all the way to New Jersey just to grow up. They return to the open seas as 4-foot-long ferocious predators, an amazing journey complete. And you see here, that image to the right, there's the Sargasso Sea. It's the only sea in the world that isn't bounded by land. The currents are basically what created the massive currents through the mid-North Atlantic have created the equivalent of this sea. And so you have this incredible life cycle. They talk about a migration, that this life cycle brings these, kind of almost premature eel, younglings through basically with the tides and with the drifts to the East Coast, where they then at that point they've been growing, and then there's tiny little eels, and then ultimately after 20 years they return to the Sargasso Sea to breed as 4-foot-long, predators, like you see up top. So that's an incredible life cycle migration, and one that really centers on the New Jersey coast, including in Cape May. And another one to point out in New Jersey, about as far of an opposite that kind of scope as you can get, is the migration of amphibians, salamanders and frogs each spring, whereby these creatures, after emerging from their wintering hibernations underground, will cross to vernal pools. And these migrations are upwards of hundreds of yards, which I joke, but they, for them, these are actually treacherous migrations, because in many cases it brings them across roads. They're going to vernal pools where there's no fish in vernal pools. They dry up for part of the year. And so since there's no fish, they can basically have their eggs safely, and their tadpoles grow up relatively safely. But to get there, they often have to cross roads, because of course New Jersey is bisected by so many thousands of miles of roads, even in our remote areas where you have these breeding pools. And so as a result, you've seen many of our salamanders and frog species that depend on these vernal pools have declined sharply in recent years. We have projects in some of the most at-risk spots where we try to block off some of these rural roads for the few nights each spring so the salamanders can make this migration. Just on the global side of things, you have wildebeest who, of course, travel with zebras and gazelles as across the Serengeti in numbers over 2 million. So really, when you think about migration worldwide, that may be the signature migration you have, is that the migration across Central Africa and the Serengeti. You have, of course, in terms of marine migrations, you have the gray whale, which can go 3,000 miles down from Alaska down to either Hawaii or down to Baja, California, the Gulf of California rather. Basically, you have these migrations that go right down the West Coast each year. And then one of my favorites, you have land crabs from Christmas Island in the Pacific. You have hundreds of thousands of these 4-inch land crabs that will spend most of their lives on trees in the jungle in the middle of the island. and then they'll migrate out to the coast each year at the same time. So you have these mass migrations of crabs. They even have crab crossovers where the crabs can cross certain roads. So incredible to see the kind of natural cycles in action. And so we've talked about migration. Well, how is migration changing? Birds are just getting lazier, obviously. That's a real picture. The red-winged blackbird. That's actually, it has nothing to do with migration, but it really fits in. Um, Red-winged blackbirds, crows will harass raptors like the eagle to get them out of an area because they're intimidated by them. Owls, they want to get them out. They're a threat. And so in this case, they went beyond harassing and actually hitched a ride. But in reality, the way migration is changing is that many birds have slowed to where, as I mentioned earlier, some species, you have some birds migrating and others don't. Uh, Canada goose is the perfect example, not in a good way, unfortunately. So it's a native species. It's not an exotic or invasive species, but it's a native species that has adapted in such a way that it's gone from being this kind of magnificent migrant that has always been celebrated. I mean, to give you an example, when I was at Yellowstone about 20 years ago, when I went to the visitor center the very first day, uh, I think the first brochure I picked up, it was like, kind of the general brochure, Yellowstone, and it gave three species. It had the grizzly, it had the elk, and then it had the Canada goose, and as the signature species. And and I had to laugh. I mean, here, it's not what we would consider a source of pride. Unfortunately, their numbers have, because they've adapted too well to human civilization. They've now gotten so prominent and populous that they've not only fouled many of our waterways and lakes, ponds, and grasslands and parks, but they've also, because they're so numerous, they also, in many ways, chase out other birds, as do swans, Canada goose. Some of the other ones that have adapted too well have chased out some of the other waterfowl and other birds that might be otherwise using these areas. So that's certainly a negative adaptation for our purposes. Obviously, it's great for the goose, not so great for people. Um, but in the broader sense, the biggest changes to migration, of course, are through climate change. We're seeing well over 4 out of 5 species are now considered at risk in some way. The biggest change is that each year, you have basically the gap between, so birds have typically timed their arrival to when the green up is happening. What I mean by that is when the plants are budding, when insects are emerging, basically when all the things they need for food and for raising young are perfectly timed. In recent years, meaning over the last like 20 or 30 years, each year you have a half-day gap there. Half day doesn't sound like much, but when you factor that in over, say, 30 years, now you're talking a couple weeks difference, and a couple weeks is a huge difference for a bird trying to raise its young after a major migration. And so now, in many cases, you might have all the ideal activity of insects and plants and seeds and all the food sources at its peak 2 weeks before those same birds arrive. And that can be the difference between surviving and not surviving. At the very least, it certainly has played a major role in the declines of a lot of these songbirds. You're also seeing impacts from climate change on everything from mating and the diet itself, for the reasons I just mentioned. The prey and predators could be very different. Parasites could be different. But temperatures also, with the temperatures being warmer and warmer, it can make birds have to move further and further north. You look at the image to the left, many of the ranges have shifted. And for some birds, that's been fine. They've shifted their range. They found similar habitat to what they need. For other birds, though, it hasn't worked, because if they need to shift their, because of warmer temperatures, they need to shift their range, say 100 or 300 miles north. Well, maybe the habitat they need isn't there 300 miles north, because of development. So this is very much a kind of, it's creating moving targets, and it's created immense challenges for many of these species. And what's at stake beyond the individual birds, for people, it's a tremendous amount at stake too. Birds eat so many insects, eat so many caterpillars and other insects of varying ages and stages, that if their numbers are to decline, we would absolutely see major insect outbreaks. We'd see major defoliation of leaves, and major impacts on our agriculture, in addition to just the simple loss of the beauty of the bird song, and the stunning beauty of seeing birds out our windows, that we rely on, and that kind of make every day that much better. We're studying, both the Conserve Wildlife and other groups and agencies. The ways to study birds have increased so much. You not only have all these genetic analyses that you can do now, you can do radar imaging, which is phenomenal. Satellite tracking. We use geolocators and radio telemetry to track individual birds, and so there's just far more ways to study migrating birds now than were available 20, 30 years ago. And yet, that being said, one of the great ways for studying birds here, we're back to the red knot, is this is in Cape May. We have teams of scientists and volunteers from around the world every May that shoot these cannon nets. There's basically a boom of a cannon that shoots a net out when conditions are ideal. You have a whole flock in the location. The net lands on the birds safely. It's a loose net. The volunteers and scientists run out. We take our measurements of the endangered and threatened birds, like the red knot or ruddy turnstone. We take our measurements. We put a small band around their leg. We check their health and set them free in a span of minutes. And the data it gives us, this is how we found out about moonbird, through a tagging and banding event just like this one. And so, as much as we have those advances in technology, we still need the hands on the ground, boots on the ground, volunteer and science that makes that possible in the first place. So migration hotspots, New Jersey is in an ideal location, right along the Atlantic Flyway. We have such a wide range of habitat in our small state. Even though we're so densely populated, we have the wide range of habitat. We have a very varied coastline, and we're kind of situated in that ideal place where we have northern habitat mixing with southern habitat. And so as a result, we get species that are really kind of the best of both worlds. And the migration, because we're right along the flyway, the migration bears that out. So there's no shortage of great viewing areas. In northern New Jersey, you have places like Chimney Rock and the Palisades, Montclair Hawk Watch. You have Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania. All of these are great, but then again, I'm giving a talk for Cape May County Library, so I'm preaching to the choir. I think we all know we're the best place. I'll be at that in the next slide. One of the more interesting ways to see bird migration and bird life and marine life is through Pelagic Tours, which launch from different parts of the New Jersey coast. Through tours like this, we've seen birds like Atlantic puffin and a number of different shearwater species and murres, species that you would never see on land in New Jersey, but yet they're in our waters. And in many cases, they fly from as far away as the southern Atlantic and up by the Arctic. So you really get a different view of migration and seabirds from the water. But of course, the preeminent place in the whole East Coast for bird watching and for migration in particular is the Hawk Watch at Cape May. Absolutely phenomenal and globally important. You have people coming in from all over the world to bird watch here in Cape May every year. New Jersey Audubon leads some incredible tours. They have really great guides, so I strongly recommend if you have a chance to get out there during the migration each spring and fall. Um, During their festivals, there's great ways to get up to speed if you're not, if you're still very much an amateur birder. They can really point out incredible migration, different species and other elements of the migration. And if you are a great birder, it's still there's still no better place to get out than during these festivals. Just to put Cape May into perspective, I'm going to wrap it up here with another reading from the book Wild New Jersey. I can't remember exactly what I was doing on September 30th, 1994, but I can tell you this: 5,257 broad-winged hawks migrated past Cape May that day. In the previous decade, the year 1984 stands out for a lot of reasons. Whether George Orwell or Van Halen comes to mind is a matter of taste. But in Cape May, 1984 was the year that 61,167 sharp-shinned hawks migrated past from the end of August to early December. And 298 peregrine falcons passed through Cape May on October 5th, 2002. That's nearly 300 birds of a species that couldn't be found at all in New Jersey only 30 years earlier. If you haven't guessed, Cape May is arguably the best place for birds in the nation, and in turn, for bird watchers. Once America's first beach resort, Cape May is for birders what Las Vegas is for gamblers. Sure, there are other places you can go, but nowhere else offers the sheer spectacle that overtakes the Cape during the fall migration. And while everything that happens in Vegas is meant to stay in Vegas, the birds that pass through Cape May could be a continent away before you know it. So yes, you're literally in the perfect place in the world for looking at birds, Cape May. Beyond that, beyond your own windows and beyond all the great places to go in Cape May, I invite you to take a look at our wildlife webcams. We have nest webcams for two different peregrine falcon peregrine falcon nests in New Jersey. We have a bald eagle nest that we do in partnership with Duke Farms. And we have a osprey nest that we started last year at Long Beach Island. Each of these gives different views, in some cases we have audio. So you have often views within the nest and then outside the nest, so you can kind of see the real intimate behaviors, but also then see the more interaction with the surrounding environment. And it's all free and it's all on our website, which I'll put up in a moment. And lastly, I invite you to do everything you can to try to get involved in some way with helping wildlife here in New Jersey. It can take many forms. One of the best ways to do it is planting native plants. I mentioned with pollinators earlier, but birds depend on healthy populations of pollinators and insects as well. So it really benefits the whole food chain if you can plant native either in your yard or in your community center, your church, your workplace, whatever it could be, help spread the word. Also putting up bird feeders, bat boxes, bird nesting boxes, those make a big difference. Getting out and being active in terms of your community, your neighbors, volunteering on projects, of course, whether with Conserve Wildlife Foundation or other groups. There's a lot of great nature groups in New Jersey that you can get involved with and volunteer in hands-on wildlife projects. I know we have a project that we partner with many groups on horseshoe crabs, return a favor, that you can do in Cape May County. You can reach out to us for more information about that. Finally, of course, voting and advocating goes a long way to make sure that there is a focus on a healthy environment and kind of things like climate change and wildlife protection. And lastly, supporting groups like Conserve Wildlife Foundation as a nonprofit also goes a long way. Our website is conservewildlifenj.org. We have very detailed field guide pages that you can find on many of the species we talked about and countless others. We also have those webcams I mentioned, and we're about to launch a whole new mobile-friendly website next month that would be really photo-driven and offer a ton of additional content beyond what we already have, which is quite extensive. So I invite you to check us out. And I thank you so much to everyone for joining me today, and to Cape May County Library for hosting this event, and invite you to enjoy your evening. Thank you.